Sega GT, also known as Sega GT, Homologation Special in Japan, was Sega's response to Sony's immensely popular Gran Turismo series. Released in 2000 for the Dreamcast, this racing simulation game was developed by WoW Entertainment and focused on a realistic driving experience, complete with licensed cars, tuning options, and detailed tracks. Sega GT was ambitious in its attempt to compete with Gran Turismo, and while it didn't manage to surpass it in terms of popularity or critical acclaim, the game developed a dedicated fan base and is remembered as a notable entry in the Dreamcast library. The game included a simulation mode in which players could participate in various tournaments, earn licenses, and buy or upgrade cars using money earned through races. The game featured more than 130 licensed cars from major manufacturers like Toyota, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. Additionally, Sega GT was one of the first games to offer a car creation mode, allowing players to build their own cars from scratch, choosing various parts, engines, and bodies, which was an innovative feature for its time. Sega GT placed a strong emphasis on realistic physics and handling, with a focus on fine-tuning cars to fit different track conditions and racing requirements. The cars felt heavier and more grounded than in arcade-style games, which appealed to players looking for a more authentic driving experience. While Sega GT was well received by Dreamcast fans and praised for its realistic approach, it didn't quite reach the critical acclaim or sales figures of Gran Turismo, partly due to the Dreamcast's limited user base. The game was appreciated for its innovation in car customization and was generally regarded as a high-quality simulation racer. Sega later released a sequel, Sega GT 2002, on the Xbox, where it saw improved graphics and gameplay mechanics, ultimately gaining a wider audience on Microsoft's platform. Despite the Dreamcast version's moderate commercial success, Sega GT remains a beloved classic among retro racing fans for its ambition and contributions to the genre. The development of Sega GT on the Dreamcast was a significant technical undertaking for Sega, as the game aimed to compete directly with the technical prowess of Sony's Gran Turismo series on the PlayStation. Developed by Sega's WoW Entertainment, formerly known as AM1, the project utilized Sega's internal expertise and the Dreamcast's hardware capabilities to push the boundaries of racing simulation on the console. The Dreamcast, with its PowerVR2 GPU and SH4 CPU, was a powerful console for its time, particularly in terms of handling 3D graphics and texture mapping. Sega GT's development team took full advantage of this hardware to create high-resolution car models and detailed track environments. Each car model used thousands of polygons, which allowed for more detailed representations than most earlier racing games. The PowerVR2 GPU's tile-based rendering architecture helped reduce memory bandwidth usage, which allowed developers to maintain smoother frame rates despite high-detail models and complex textures. The Dreamcast's 8MB video RAM was a constraint, and the team had to optimize texture sizes and carefully manage memory usage, especially with the game's goal of offering a large variety of cars with distinct appearances and details. To make Sega GT a legitimate simulation competitor, WoW Entertainment created a custom physics engine that aimed to accurately simulate weight distribution, tire grip, and the effects of car tuning on performance. The physics engine calculated momentum, friction, and inertia in real time to create a driving experience where players could feel the weight and responsiveness of each car. A major focus was tire dynamics, specifically, how the tire's contact patch interacted with the road. This added realism by calculating how much traction each tire had based on weight transfer during acceleration, braking, and cornering. The team also implemented a suspension model that adjusted the car's response based on track conditions and the vehicle's configuration, allowing players to tune aspects like tire pressure, spring stiffness, and damper settings. Creating a visually appealing yet high-performing game on the Dreamcast required significant rendering optimizations. The team implemented techniques like backface culling and level of detail, LOD, scaling to reduce the processing load by decreasing detail for distant objects. Sega GT also used dynamic texture loading to keep up with the game's high texture demands while staying within the limitations of the Dreamcast's memory. Track environments were complex, with hills, turns, and varied scenery, so developers had to make heavy use of spatial partitioning to optimize rendering. By only rendering visible sections of the track, the engine could maintain a stable frame rate even on the more visually demanding courses. Sega GT had modest sales compared to its direct competitor, Gran Turismo, but it performed reasonably well given the Dreamcast's limited market reach. Released toward the end of the Dreamcast's life cycle in 2000, Sega GT faced challenges in building momentum as Sega was already winding down support for the console by 2001. Exact global sales figures for Sega GT are hard to pinpoint. Sega GT was positively reviewed and anticipated, especially among Sega and Dreamcast fans who were looking for a quality racing simulation. Sales in Japan were relatively strong initially, given the popularity of car culture and racing games in the region. However, Sega GT didn't reach the blockbuster status that Sega might have hoped for, selling in the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. In North America and Europe, the game had more limited sales traction. It appealed to racing enthusiasts, but couldn't reach the wide demographic appeal of Gran Turismo. Additionally, Dreamcast sales had started to slow significantly in these regions by the time Sega GT was released. This was compounded by the PlayStation 2's release in early 2000 in Japan and later that year in North America, which drew attention and market share away from the Dreamcast and its new releases. Estimated total sales for Sega GT on the Dreamcast are typically placed around 200,000 to 300,000 copies worldwide, though some sources speculate it may have been slightly higher when including budget re-releases and regional editions. This is a respectable number for a late-era Dreamcast title, but it was nowhere near the multi-million sales figures of Gran Turismo 2, which sold over 3 million units on the original PlayStation during that same period. After Sega GT's launch on the Dreamcast, several technical issues were noted by players and reviewers, which impacted its reception as a competitor to Gran Turismo. While Sega GT generally aimed to maintain a stable frame rate, certain tracks with dense scenery or high levels of detail would cause the game to dip below its target. This was especially noticeable during races, with multiple cars on screen, where the Dreamcast struggled to render all of the high-polygon car models smoothly. The frame rate drops were criticized by players as they disrupted the fluidity of the racing experience, which is crucial in simulation games where precise control and timing are essential. The Dreamcast's memory limitations caused occasional texture pop-in on distant objects and environmental elements. Some track details, like trees and buildings, would appear suddenly as players approached, which could be jarring and detracted from the immersion. This issue stemmed from the developers' need to balance detail levels with the console's limited VRAM, especially on tracks with complex layouts or long view distances. There were also reports of minor visual artifacts, such as shimmering edges and aliasing, which were noticeable on high-contrast textures or intricate car designs. The AI drivers in Sega GT were programmed to have distinct driving behaviors and characteristics, but they occasionally exhibited unpredictable or erratic behavior, especially in tight corners or under certain track conditions. Some AI drivers would unexpectedly slow down or take inefficient racing lines, which broke immersion and could frustrate players. Additionally, the AI didn't always adapt well to different car setups, leading to situations where they would collide with each other or drive aggressively even in situations that called for a defensive approach. Loading times in Sega GT were noted as somewhat longer than average for Dreamcast games, especially when entering new tracks or switching cars in the garage. This issue was partly due to the game's detailed car models and customization options, which required significant data to be loaded into memory. Players reported that this issue was more pronounced on older Dreamcast units or after extended play sessions, as the disc reader would slow down, resulting in additional loading delays. While Sega GT's physics engine was generally praised for realism, there were some issues with collision detection that surfaced in certain scenarios. For example, collisions with track barriers or other cars didn't always result in realistic responses, sometimes causing cars to bounce or stick to surfaces instead of reacting naturally. This glitch was particularly frustrating on narrow tracks, where even minor collisions could disrupt the flow of a race. There were also occasional physics glitches where cars would briefly clip through the road or other objects, which broke the immersion and could lead to unexpected race outcomes. Some players reported audio glitches in the form of looping or cut-off sounds, particularly with engine noise and environmental effects. This was usually due to a glitch in the sound engine that failed to properly adjust audio cues based on car actions. Occasionally, engine sounds would continue to loop indefinitely even after a car had come to a stop, or environmental sounds would cut out abruptly, creating a disjointed auditory experience. One of the more serious issues reported by a subset of players was save file corruption. Although not a widespread problem, there were enough reports to suggest that some players experienced data corruption when saving progress, especially if they powered off the console during saving or after long play sessions. Since the game relied on memory card saves, this issue was highly inconvenient, and players who encountered it would lose hours of progress. The licensing for Sega GT was a complex but essential component of the game's development. To compete with Gran Turismo, which had a wide range of real-world car manufacturers and models, Sega GT needed to secure similar partnerships to ensure that it could offer a realistic roster of licensed vehicles. Licensed manufacturers and models. Sega GT featured over 130 licensed cars from Japanese and international manufacturers. These included well-known brands such as Toyota, Nissan, Mitsubishi, Mazda, Subaru, Honda. Each car required individual licensing agreements, covering not only the use of each brand's logo and car designs, but also specifications and model details. This was a significant step forward for Sega, as it was the first time they had pursued licensing on such a large scale for a racing game. To make the game as authentic as possible, Sega worked with manufacturers to include accurate specifications for each model, such as horsepower, torque, weight, and drivetrain configurations. They aimed to replicate the real-world characteristics of these cars within the game's simulation model. These detailed specifications allowed players to experience each car's unique feel, which was a vital aspect of the game's realism. Vehicle modeling and brand requirements. As part of the licensing agreements, car manufacturers required that their vehicles be modeled accurately in terms of appearance and performance. Sega had to adhere to each brand's visual guidelines, for example, ensuring the correct proportions, logos, colors, and exterior details. Each model underwent a review process with the manufacturers, and any inaccuracies were required to be corrected before approval. Sega's development team took high-resolution photos and collected blueprints for each car model to ensure accurate 3D representations. Some manufacturers had specific guidelines for how their vehicles could appear in-game. For example, certain brands restricted visible damage or required cars to be displayed in pristine condition, even if the game allowed for collisions. This posed challenges for the game's physics and collision systems, as Sega had to balance realism with respect for brand image. Sega GT received a mix of positive and critical reviews upon its release in 2000. Reviewers generally appreciated the game's attempt at offering a simulation-based experience similar to Gran Turismo, especially on the Dreamcast, where racing fans were eager for a high-quality simulation racer. However, Sega GT also faced criticism in a few key areas, particularly regarding its technical execution and polish. Graphics and visuals. Positive, reviewers praised the visuals for their detail, particularly the high-polygon car models and realistic reflections, which were impressive for the Dreamcast. The game's vibrant colors, detailed car textures, and lighting effects were highlighted as strengths. Critical, however, some critics noted occasional texture pop-in and frame rate drops, especially on more complex tracks. These issues were particularly noticeable in comparison to the smooth performance of Gran Turismo 2 on the PlayStation. While the car models were visually appealing, the backgrounds and track environments were seen as somewhat bland, lacking the detail found in other racing titles. Car roster and licensing. Positive, Sega GT was lauded for its roster of over 130 licensed cars, which included popular Japanese brands like Toyota, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. For Dreamcast owners, this variety offered a level of authenticity that was rare on the console, and the customization options were well received, adding depth to gameplay. Critical. Despite the large roster, some reviewers criticized the lack of well-known European and American car brands, as Sega's licensing primarily focused on Japanese manufacturers. This limited international appeal somewhat, especially for Western audiences who wanted a broader selection of cars. Gameplay and realism. Positive. The game's simulation mode received praise for providing a structured, progression-based experience similar to Gran Turismo. Players appreciated the licensing tests, tuning options, and the ability to earn credits to buy and modify cars. The ability to build cars from scratch in Carrozzeria mode, the car creation feature, was unique and innovative at the time. Critical. Some reviewers found the physics engine and handling to be less refined than Gran Turismo. While Sega GT aimed for realism, it sometimes felt too heavy and unresponsive, particularly when using the Dreamcast's analog stick. Additionally, the AI behavior was inconsistent, with opponents occasionally making unrealistic driving choices or lacking challenge in certain races. Sound design. Positive. The game's engine sounds and ambient noise were generally praised, as they provided decent auditory feedback that enhanced the immersion. Each car had unique engine sounds based on its specifications, adding realism to the experience. Critical. However, the soundtrack itself received mixed reviews. The music was described as repetitive and somewhat generic, lacking the dynamic quality found in games with licensed soundtracks. Additionally, some players encountered audio glitches, such as looping or cut-off sounds, which detracted from the overall sound experience. Overall reception and comparison to Gran Turismo. Positive. For Dreamcast owners, Sega GT was considered one of the best racing simulators on the platform. The game's attempt to provide a Gran Turismo-style experience on Sega's hardware was appreciated, and it filled a niche for fans of realistic racing games. Critical. Comparisons to Gran Turismo were inevitable, and most reviewers felt that Sega GT fell short. Critics noted that, while Sega GT was ambitious and competent, it didn't have the polish or technical finesse of Gran Turismo 2, which had already set a high standard for the genre. The lack of real-world tracks and more varied international brands made it harder for Sega GT to stand out. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the world of Sega GT for the Dreamcast. This game may not have reached the heights of Gran Turismo, but it offered a unique experience on Sega's legendary console, pushing boundaries with its detailed car roster, customization options, and dedication to racing realism. Despite a few technical setbacks, Sega GT has carved out a place in retro gaming history as an ambitious title worth remembering. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell here at No Drama Llama Gaming. We dive deep into the classics, exploring the gameplay, development stories, and lasting impact of retro games and consoles. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time as we keep exploring the classics.